Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. Many of us are familiar with the beliefs held by some Christians regarding evolution. Evolutionary theory also presents challenges for another religion, Islam. Dr. Khadija Fawad is with us today to talk about Islam and evolution. Welcome, Dr. Fawad.
Thank you.
To begin with, Khadija, I have this beautiful image I'd like for us to look at for just a second and have you comment on. The reason I include this partly is because it's on the dedication page of your dissertation and it caught my attention. So if we could look at this image and if you would pronounce for me, is it the Basmala?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the Basmala, here we go. If you could just tell us what this is, what it stands for, what it means. For a moment.
So this phrase that's written in Arabic on the metal means in the name of God, and then it talks about God's attributes of loving kindness, that God is the most loving and kind and perpetually always is loving and kind. The particular images of a medal that's awarded by the Boy Scouts. So it's a religious emblem.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is a Muslim Boy Scout, they could earn this emblem.
And then this would be one of their badges.
Yes.
And this is a beautiful presentation of it here. So the translation of the Arabic you just provided us, is that from the Quran?
So it's a verse in the Quran. It precedes every chapter except one chapter. So the Quran starts with it, and it's traditional for Muslims to start actions by pronouncing that. So that's why I put it as the dedication.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. Okay. So more specifically, in your work, you're interested in, and I'm fascinated by this research. You're interested in the relationship between Islamic faith and acceptance of evolutionary theory, and as one might assume or think, there seems to be some barriers to acceptance of evolutionary theory that you're trying to get at, and looking at that in a way to suggest how students might be made more open to accepting evolutionary theory. Could you tell us just a little bit about your research and what you have found, and maybe some specifics about Islam itself that would help us to understand the dynamics going on here? So
just as a brief introduction to Islam, it's a monotheistic faith. It's one of the three Abrahamic faiths.
Mm-hmm.
And so all Muslims believe that there's one God and that he created everything. And not only created, but he's responsible for maintaining creation. Everything is dependent on God. And then all Muslims believe that God sent a revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, and that this was recorded in as the Quran that we have today. So that Quran we have today is the same one that was revealed 1,400 years ago. This is a belief generally. I looked at four different groups of Muslims in my survey. So the majority of Muslims are Sunni Muslims, and they hold that the successorship after Prophet Muhammad died would go to certain of his followers.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, and I think there are about, if I remember correctly, about half of the Muslims in the U.S. and about 85% worldwide.
Are Sunni.
Are 80% worldwide
Mm-hmm.
are Sunni. And then Shia Muslims, and the ones in my survey were all 12ers, they're called.
Right.
So they believe that there's 12 pious successors to the Prophet Muhammad, and that these people are endowed with greater spiritual knowledge than other people, and so they serve as examples or exemplars.
Okay.
For us to follow, and that the leadership of the Muslims should have gone to these people, although historically it only went to one of them. And then a third group of people that I looked at were Ahmadi Muslims, and Ahmadi Muslims, they believe that the reformer who's been promised by different religious faiths has come in the person of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who lived at the turn of the 20th century. So they believe there's an awaited figure called a Imam Mahdi in Islam, that he's the return of Christ, the return of Krishna.
So he's a Messiah type figure.
A messianic figure,
Okay.
yes. So
mm-hmm.
he's called the promised Messiah by his followers. So this is a minority group, and it's about 1% worldwide. I'm not quite sure what the percentage is in the US, but it's a small minority group. So I use that as a representative of minorities in general, minorities within Islam in general. And then a fourth group are people who identify as just Muslim, and they don't give an affiliation if you ask them.
So one thing that I take from that is that, on the one hand, when we talk about Islam, you talk about some big ideas. The idea of there being one God, Allah, and that God, Allah, is responsible for creation and the maintenance of creation. And another big idea, the Quran, is his revelation through the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes.
So all Muslims more or less would accept that. But then the other thing that you mentioned here is that there's a great diversity among the Muslim community. So there are different groups, just like there would be different groups in other religions. So we can't, I guess we're on dangerous ground when we assume all Muslims believe certain things about evolution. So is there something about the belief in a creator God specifically that causes perhaps hurdles or to accepting evolutionary theory? Is the idea of a creator God and evolution incompatible amongst Muslims who don't accept evolutionary theory?
So there were different ways that the respondents had of negotiating the relationship between religion and science. So one was, as you mentioned, a conflict stance, to where there's a conflict between religion and science.
Right.
And so if a person had that viewpoint, they might see accepting evolution as incompatible with religion, potentially. Although it was a little more complicated than that with my respondents, because they would qualify that only if it caused the person to stop believing in God. So even the people who held that conflict stance acknowledged that there could be people who accept evolution but who still believe in God, and then so they wouldn't see a conflict there.
So the only conflict would come in accepting a scientific theory that would essentially lead one toward atheism, I guess. Is that the kind of only real conflict that would occur?
It would be if it led to atheism.
If it led to atheism.
They qualify that. They didn't seem to think that it would necessarily lead to atheism.
Okay.
So only if it led to atheism.
Okay.
And then another stance, that the most common stance that people had, was that religion and science are integrated, that they form a part of a complete whole, and that you need both to fully understand any phenomenon. And the respondents very frequently, if I asked them if there was a conflict between religion and science, they would specifically say that for Islam there's no conflict. They might acknowledge that that might exist for other religions, but they would say in Islam there is no conflict.
Okay.
Another way of negotiating this is independence. And so in independence view, religion has a function and science has a function, and those functions are different and separate.
So there's really no interaction between the two?
Right,
Okay.
or for the most part.
Okay.
And then a fourth view was dialogue, which is that you use metaphors from one to explain the other, or one answers questions the others can't.
So it's really quite complex. And,
Yes.
and it reminds me very much of the way that Christians might respond to the same
Yes.
sorts of questions about the relationship between evolution and science. There's a conflictual view, an integrative view, and then a view that sees no conflict, but really sees these two realms as being different realms of knowledge entirely. Is that a fair kind of summary?
It is, and I took those four categories from Hugh Barber, and he did his work originally, I think, based on Judaism and Christianity. So, I thought it was applicable to Muslims since they are another Abrahamic faith, and since I was looking
Right.
at Muslims in the West, but some people argue that wouldn't hold maybe for other faith traditions or non-Western faith traditions, but it seemed to work for my respondents, and certainly Christians would fall into those categories, or Jewish people. Yes.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned the Quran as the revelation of Allah through the Prophet Muhammad. What specifically does the Quran say about God's creative act? Or are there specifics about creation in the Quran?
There are specifics about creation in the Quran. So according to the Quran, God created the earth and everything in it for a purpose, not for idle sport. So this is a teleological view.
The idea that everything has, I guess, has a purpose,
Yes.
an end purpose.
Yes.
So that's a teleological
And then,
perspective.
and then, as I mentioned, there's this sense of God as nurturing creation so that it can't exist without His care. So the idea that God just created things and let them go would be antithetical to what the Quran says about creation. There are specific things, so it says in the Quran that God created everything, but the Quran goes into more detail about the creation of Adam than it does about animals or plants or things like this. So in the Quran, there's various ways that it's described. So Adam is created from clay, from sounding clay, from stinking rotten mud. So different descriptions are given, and God breathes the spirit into him. So this more specific description of the creation of Adam in the Quran gave some respondents pause about accepting evolution for humans because of that specific description. But I have to give a caveat. It wasn't really straightforward again.
Right.
So some people claim that because of their literal interpretation of that verse, they had to reject evolution for humans. And it wasn't specifically mentioned for the other animals, but some of them would say, I want to reject evolution for them.
But they're reading that verse literally.
Let me also specify what I mean by evolution.
Okay.
So there's the process of evolution, you can think of it as having different components. So one is macroevolution, or the idea that one species can turn into another, like a fish could turn into an amphibian, could turn into a reptile.
Okay.
The other is microevolution, the idea that once a species is formed, it can undergo changes. So for example, human beings, as they migrated away from the equator, they became lighter in color. So they're still human beings, but there's a microevolutionary change that's gone on.
Okay.
What I found with my respondents was that none of them rejected microevolution.
Even the literalist, the ones
none
who
of
would.
them rejected it.
Okay.
And I can explain, but so none of them rejected microevolution. With macroevolution, they sorted into three groups. So you had people who accepted macroevolution for all species. You had people who accepted it for all species except humans, and then people who accepted it for no species.
Right. Okay.
So those were the three groups I had. So then the way these three groups related to the Quranic verses, I found with the theistic evolutionists, the people who accepted macro and microevolution for all species.
And theistic evolutionists.
So they believe in God, and they believe that the evolutionary processes are that God has control over them.
Okay.
So this is the way that God creates things.
Through evolution.
Through evolution.
Using evolution as a tool or a process.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
So with these people, I had some that would say that they used a metaphorical interpretation of the verses about the creation of Adam to be able to accept evolution. But I did have some that said they used a literal interpretation of that verse to accept evolution. So one of them explained how early on in the process of the creation of life, clay was very important in that process.
Sure.
And so by saying Adam is created from clay, literally clay had to play an important role in evolution. So he said the evolution is in the Quran, and that's why he accepted it.
So that respondent in particular used his understanding of the Quran to explain evolution, right?
Yes.
So that's really quite interesting.
Yeah.
And saw no conflict, even though that respondent was coming at it from a literal interpretation of the Quran. It just gets very complicated because you've got some who are reading these verses literally, some who are reading them metaphorically, and some who are reading them literally go in two very different directions with conclusions. They would.
Well, and with the other two groups, even with the acceptance of evolution for all but humans or rejection of macroevolution for all, they also had both literal and metaphorical interpretations that informed the way they negotiated the relationship between religion and science. So it wasn't straightforward.
Right.
Some of them specifically said the Quran is metaphorical and so on.
Do you have a feel for, I know in Christianity there are certain Christians who claim to read the Bible literally, and certain Christians who accept the metaphorical reading of parts of Scripture. Do you have a feel for Muslims, or is there a majority of Muslims who read the Bible, the Quran, either literally or metaphorically, or is that just too hard to get a grasp on?
So I have, I think there has been survey data on that, and I don't recall what the numbers are. With my particular sample, it was a purposive sampling, so it's not representative. So I can't extrapolate from the people I interviewed.
But it's safe to say that there are Muslims who read metaphorically
both
and
ways.
literally, and a combination of the two, I would guess.
So previous researchers thought that those Muslims who used a literal translation couldn't accept evolution. But so one of my questions was, do you interpret the Quran literally or metaphorically?
Right.
And I didn't have follow-ups, but some people felt the need to comment on that question. And so they explained what they meant. So some talked about how the Quran was metaphorical. Some talked about how you had to understand the context in which a verse was revealed, and also its context within the Quran as a whole in order to interpret it. You can't just pluck a verse out.
Right.
And several of them mentioned that that's the sort of things that terrorists do to justify terrorism, and they're wrong in doing it that way because that distorts the meaning. And then, so there was some talked about how you need a scholar to help you interpret it, that you need a knowledgeable person to help you interpret it.
Right. You know, one thing I found interesting about your description of the Quran dealing with creation is that our Jewish and Christian listeners would hear stark similarities between the Quran's description of creation of Adam and the Jewish and Christian descriptions of Adam. So it's interesting to me that here we're talking about science and we're really getting at a kind of comparative religion analysis.
There's one important difference in the way Muslims view creation. So certain fundamentalist Christians, or I think a subset of Christians, and I think Jews also, believe the earth is 6,000 years old, but by no means all.
Right.
But the Muslims don't hold that belief. So in the Quran it says that everything was created in 6 days, but the word yaum used for day, it doesn't necessarily mean a 24-hour period. It's sort of like the word day in English. Like if I say back in my day, I'm not talking about a 24-hour period.
Right.
So they can interpret that as meaning long periods of time that would include hundreds of millions or even billions of years. And I specifically asked my respondents about it, and regardless of their stance on macroevolution, most of them thought that millions of years was reasonable. I think the shortest time, some people said, well, maybe thousands of millions sounds like a lot, but it wasn't based on any religious doctrine or anything like that. But most of them, even if they rejected macroevolution, they said, oh, we know there's been things that have been alive for hundreds of millions of years, and I've got no problem with that time frame. I reject the 6,000. And then I heard the same thing from the theistic evolutionists.
So there's no real reluctance to accept the idea of an old earth in Islam.
Not at all.
And not all Christians and Jews reject that idea either. But there are, as you said, a subset that have this young earth theory that is another roadblock to acceptance of evolution.
Another key difference is in the story of Noah. So so some Christians believe that the entire earth was flooded, and then that presents a bottleneck for evolution, because then you have everything that's on earth now had to have evolved from those things that Noah put on the ark.
I see.
But in Islam it says Noah's people flooded.
Oh.
So there's no notion that the entire earth flooded.
So it's not a worldwide flood?
No, it was a flood for those particular people that Noah brought the message to, the warning to.
Huh. But there is the story of Noah and the flood in the Quran.
Noah and the flood is in the Quran.
Fascinating.
Many of the prophets that people are familiar with from the Bible would be in the Quran.
Well, when I teach Islam in my classes, my students are sometimes surprised to hear that Adam and Noah and Abraham, Jesus and Mary are all in the Quran. Yeah. So let me switch gears just a little bit. I think I read in some of your work that when say Islamic students who have a reluctance to accept evolutionary theory or have trouble with some scientific theories, when they view science as a tool for understanding the natural world rather than as proven fact, it helps to open them up to using science. Am I correct there? Is that a principle that you have seen a kind of shifting the understanding of what science is a little bit, just to make it more palatable from a religious perspective?
So part of my research deals with the nature of science and understanding what the nature of the scientific enterprise is.
Right.
So the generally accepted view among philosophers, not that they all agree on everything.
And you teach philosophy of science, right? Yes, okay, good.
So is that science is a tool. We don't view a theory as being correct. We view it as being a useful model that we can use to make predictions that are fruitful. And so the idea that it represents truth with a capital T, any idea in science, we say things are subject to falsification,
right.
and they may change with new evidence and so on.
But don't you think in kind of in the popular culture, that's not the view most people hold
Right.
of science. They tend to view science as hard and fast rules and facts rather than theories being subject to the principle of falsification. Am I
yes.
overstating that? Okay.
You're not, and I did ask my respondents specifically about theories and laws, and some people had, and about scientific evidence, and some people held those views, whereas other people had more informed views that they were tools, as I said. And interestingly, so people have done correlational research, and they find that people who have a better understanding of the nature of science are more likely to accept evolution. But again, these are correlations. So when
right.
I interviewed my individual people, I had people with excellent understandings of nature of science who rejected macroevolution. And on the other hand, I had people who accepted evolution for all, but their understandings of nature of science were a little dicey. So, and I did sort of see that correlation in my sample, but again, it's important not to, it's important not to forget that you have all sorts of people in the range.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know as a scientist, you're reluctant to extrapolate from your findings to general statements, but I'm going to ask you to do that just a little bit here. It seems to me that the topic of this program is religion in life. How does religion impact our everyday living? I think your research seems to have some really grand implications for this. If you can gain a better understanding of the relationship between faith and one's approach to an acceptance of science, then this should have some pretty far-reaching implications for science education, I would think. If you can open up the world of students that might otherwise be reluctant. Am I overstating that, or do you see that as kind of a future of your research?
So I do see some implications that I would like to further study. Several of my respondents mentioned that they saw science and religion as being integrated because they were aware of the work of Muslim scientists in the past.
Oh, good.
So what's not commonly known is that Western modern science is actually built on contributions of Muslim scientists, or I shouldn't, Muslim broadly, let's say as scientists in the Arabic-speaking world. As Europe was the Latin-speaking world, the scientists used Latin as a language of communication. In the Islamic world, people used Arabic as a language of communication, regardless of whether that was their native language or not.
Right.
And so those Arabic writings were foundational to Western modern science. But usually what happens in the textbooks, you got the Greeks, and then they skip to the Enlightenment like nothing happened in between. And so leaving that
Well, in fact, Arabic scientists kept scientific knowledge alive during the European Dark Ages. Is that?
I think that's an oversimplification.
Yeah.
I studied with a medievalist, and he would argue that science was happening in Europe.
Okay, all right.
So, but certainly there were some ideas that so for example, the models of planetary motion that Copernicus used were developed in the Arabic literature. He shifted them to make them heliocentric, but he basically took those from the Arabs. For example, I could give you many.
Sure.
And these things are just left out of the textbooks normally. So if you put those in, then that would give the Muslim students an example of people who integrate religion and science. And then there's also, and also a pride in their religion and their heritage. There's also Muslims today who are evolutionary biologists or anthropologists who study evolution or human evolution, and giving examples of those people might serve inspirational as well. And another thing I found in my research was some of the students mentioned that they were helped to negotiate that relationship between religion and science by a special teacher.
I saw that, and not Muslim teachers, right?
They
there was a
didn't
Jewish and a Catholic teacher. I
Yes.
read it. Well, I would love to talk to you about this all day long. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Yes.
But I really thank you for coming here today. I think this has been a kind of broad-ranging discussion, and I encourage you in this research. I think it has some really promising implications for the future of science education. So thank you, Dr. Fawad.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's Religion and Life for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in, and join us next week as we explore religious extremism in Ireland.